Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast intended to help you sleep. Do you find yourself lying awake at night, mind spinning and emotions in turmoil with the anxieties of 21st century life? Do you wake up in the middle of the night and find yourself not quite able to doze back off at 3 a.m.? I'm here to help. My name is Dave, and I'm your narrator, here to talk you into a restful night. I'm someone who has struggled to sleep ever since I was a baby. I could tell you stories about how much I used to make my parents suffer, and over time I might. Before we go any further, I need to take care of some business. It's the sort of thing that usually happens towards the end of most podcasts, but since if everything goes according to plan, you're going to be asleep by the time we get there, I need to bring the stuff up now. Firstly, you can find this podcast, all the episodes, as well as some blog posts and musings on our website at sleepytimetales.net. Comments, questions, suggestions can all be emailed to contact@sleepytimetales.net. You can also find links to all of our social media there, but you can also find us on Twitter at sleepytimetales and facebook.com/sleepytimetalespodcast. We have a channel on YouTube where we will be putting up simple visualizer enhanced versions of the episodes up for your enjoyment. Search there for Sleepy Time Tales Podcast or follow the link that's in the show notes. Also in the show notes and on the website is a link to our newsletter. You can sign up there or on the website. We will make a weekly update with the latest episodes, blog posts, and maybe relevant specials or links to resources or stores that sell sleep aids, if we find anything that we think is worthwhile sharing. Also, I would appreciate any help you, the listener, can give to help me cover hosting costs. So if you find this show helpful, please hit the donate button on the website to throw a little tip in the jar. Every dollar helps and will be much appreciated if you're so inclined. As a little sweetener, I will shout out to anyone who donates $5 or more during the outro, and if you have a fun shout out or message, I'll share it there. And also, if you're so inclined, please rate and review the podcast on whatever your podcast delivery service of choice is. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, SoundCloud, pretty much anywhere, wherever you found this podcast. A 5-star review will get us in front of more people. The more people who find us, the more people we have a chance of helping find a good night's sleep. Also, if you provide any reviews, anything interesting or funny, we'll read out at the end of an episode as well. If this show helps you find a good night's sleep, it also may help others. So other than reviews, also please share this show on your social media or to any friends you think it may help. It may help others even if it doesn't help you. Most of us who suffer from sleepless nights know that not everything works for everybody. And so we're probably willing to try pretty much anything. The music in this episode and all episodes thus far is Un Désert by Kumiko. The music is available on the Free Music Archive under Creative Commons 1.0 public domain license. I've linked their website and their Patreon in the show notes, as they have some very cool stuff released under various different names that I recommend checking out. Now that the business is taken care of, let me run through the introduction and explain exactly what this podcast, a sleep aid podcast, is for. I discovered far too late in life that droning male voices have a tendency to put me into a deep sleep. I learned this when I was listening to video game podcasts and Welcome to Night Vale at bedtime, or sometimes even during the day when I was at home because I was doing shift work. Eventually, I found out that sleep podcasts are a thing. I tried one out and it worked very well for me, but when I recommended it to other friends, they didn't like the guy's voice. So I wondered if I could make an alternative. And here it is. This intro will go on for a few minutes as I explain the idea behind the podcast and why I think listening to me will help you. Then after the intro, the story will begin. Before the story starts, maybe try to wind down. Grab a glass of water and use the bathroom. Turn out the lights. Prepare yourself for the experience of sleeping as we prepare to go on a journey together to a restful night's sleep. Or maybe it's not a journey. Maybe we should think of it more as we're building a space for you, a space together, a sort of mental nest for you to settle into. The idea is that you don't listen to me too closely, unless you find me that fascinating, but I'm going to try to prevent that from happening. The story I will tell you is going to be maybe a bit confusing and pointless, maybe kind of boring, and hopefully it creates a state of mind of peaceful, maybe resignation is the word. Acceptance of that state of mind, a lack of resistance to the arms of sleep as they reach out to you. So listen to the sound of my voice as I tell you a tale. Tonight I'm trying something new. Fully written stories, as I've done so far, are very time consuming, and I think it's important that I get content out quite fast to give you, the listener, the sleepless person, as much as possible to listen to, so I can drone in your ears as much as possible. Fully written stories take quite a lot of time, and they also tend to be a bit too structured for our needs, so tonight I'm trying something new. I'm going with an improvised story. I've had the idea of a slightly realistic sci-fi universe bubbling around in the back of my brain for a couple of years now. It's kind of inspired by the Expanse and the older sci-fi that inspired that. But an idea of what the world and our solar system would look like in a world after climate change if society goes in a different direction. So I researched a few basic facts, generated a few names, and made up a basic plot, and I just started talking. So tonight's episode is quite different. The initial idea for this podcast was to make stories confusing and full of diversions and asides and slightly boring to listen to. I may have the slightly boring part down, but the diversions and asides are quite hard to script. So tonight's story is very different. I stumble and hesitate a lot. I get confused and lose track of where I am. And as I said, this is actually in line with the plan. After recording the main story, I wasn't too sure about it, so I asked my wife to listen and give me some comment. She is usually a pretty honest person. So I let her listen for a while and came back to find her nearly falling asleep at my desk. So it seemed to work. So yes, tonight be prepared for something different. Prepare for an interesting story told in a boring way that hopefully helps you get a good night's sleep. As I said, I hope you're asleep before I get to the end of the story, but don't feel pressurized. It may not work on the first night. Maybe it will take a few nights for you to get used to listening to my voice, or maybe my accent is strange to you. Maybe one episode just isn't long enough. While this is our third full episode, I'm going to assume here that this podcast goes undiscovered for an extended period. The chances of a bunch of people discovering this in the first few days, weeks, or even months seems pretty slim. If you've discovered this, I probably have a bit of an archive for you to listen to. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. In my first few weeks and months, I'm also going to try release a few extra episodes to help build up the archive, to give you, the listener, a night's worth of stories to leave running in the background. So keep an eye out once you've subscribed to see what new stuff I release. So queue up a few episodes or just run through the backlog. What I do with the sleep podcast is I just let it stream all night. I lie down in the dark with my earbuds in and I just let it run. Sometimes when I wake up at 3 a.m. the stream is still running and I let the voices waft me back to sleep. Sometimes it may be disconnected and so I need to start again. Sometimes I wake up 30 minutes before my alarm goes. Usually I just carry on listening and it knocks me right back out. Let me tell you, that 30 minutes is sometimes the most relaxing part of my night. Something about allowing yourself to relax completely right before the alarm just satisfies on a deep, deep level. So you have the basic idea. You relax and you lie in the dark. While you do that, I tell you a tale. Like as tonight, it might be a story I make up. It may be me talking about a movie or a TV show I find interesting, but not too interesting. I've actually got plans coming for a TV series recap series coming up as well, so keep an eye out for that. Out for that would probably be more appropriate. I may get some weird news stories and waffle on for a while for how that makes me feel, or use that as an inspiration for something else like our first full episode, Buddy and the Bear. This is all still quite new to me, So I don't want to decide yet exactly what my rules are. If you, the listener, find some type of things work better than others, feel free to let me know through social media or the email I provided earlier. So lie there in the dark, let my voice wash over you. Listen to things you find interesting, but try not to listen too closely. If you're too engaged, that may prevent you from falling asleep. I will try my hardest not to be too interesting, which a lot of the people I know will tell you shouldn't be too hard. I do have the habit sometimes of going on and on and on and on about things I find interesting, but nobody else does. It's a great failing I have that I'm trying to turn into a benefit, especially for you, the listener. My nighttime friend who has elected to lie in the dark, listening to my voice. Thinking about it, that does sound a bit strange, doesn't it? You're here inviting me, a stranger from somewhere in the world, probably far away, to speak to you in your sleep, to speak you to sleep. But you'll always be safe with me. I'm here to help you relax, to improve your life in a small way. Or maybe not so small. People don't sleep very well these days, and it makes their lives harder. So I'm here to do my small part to help you in a big way. To help you to face tomorrow and the day after that, well rested and better able to cope in the process with the challenges of life. I'm not going to tell you horror stories or ghost stories, unless maybe they're funny. You know, sometimes you do get a rare humorous haunting. I'm not going to focus on any of the bad parts of modern life, those things that keep us awake at night, stresses and strains. I will only share stories that relax or make your life better, even in small ways. I believe very strongly in the benefits of kindness. I want to be kind to you. I want to share kindness with you. I want you to be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up or rebuke yourself over not sleeping. Don't get tense if you just can't get yourself over the edge of sleep, even with me here in your ears trying to help. Forgive yourself, and if I don't seem to be helping, I ask that you forgive me. Holding it against me or yourself won't help you. Frustration is one of the greatest enemies of a good night's sleep. Frustration at just not being able to get below the edge, to be able to pull the warm blanket with a restful night over your head. So take a breath. Forgive the fact that you can't sleep and let my voice wash over and under you. Take another breath. Imagine the warm darkness rising up, inviting you to sleep into a better life starting tomorrow. And if you can't let go, forgive yourself and try again tomorrow. If you've had a life of insomnia, as I have, sleep can be something like an enemy. But it's not your enemy. It's a natural process that we have been pulled away from by stress and life and supposed progress that shines bright lights in our eyes at all hours. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So if you're still here with me, thank you for staying. And if you're already asleep, we'll chat again soon. And of course you aren't hearing me except maybe in a dream. So let your dreams be about the story that I'm about to tell you. The story of the human race leaving our solar system. An observer sitting in deep space, watching certain sections of the Earth's asteroid belt, or the asteroid belt of the Sol system, of which Earth is a planet, would have been familiar with the hive of activity that certain sections were. The belt had been colonized nearly 200 years earlier by descendants of mostly African peoples following the climate disasters of the 21st century. So there was a lot going on there. Resources in the asteroid belt were plentiful, so nobody went hungry or nobody struggled. Well, no one struggled to survive, although living was not an easy prospect. Mining was the most common pastime, or most common career rather, and it was dangerous working in zero-G, handling entire asteroids with just a few people and small ships. People who worked as miners, as well as the military, not that they had much in the way of fighting to do, had their bodies enhanced for the work that they did. Joints were reinforced, and the spacesuits of miners also helped accentuate muscle strength. It was more like a exoskeleton than a mere spacesuit. So this gave the miners of the belts of the spacer colonies quite a physical advantage when it came to getting the resources out of the asteroids. This also helped when people in the military and from the political classes needed to go to Earth because they were growing up in zero or very low gravities. They needed physical assistance to walk around on the planet's surface. So they wore very subtle exoskeletons and suits to help that supported their joints and their muscles, which did struggle despite the fact that they spent quite a lot of time exercising. While mining was hard work, they worked very strict maximum amounts of hours so that they could focus on leisure time and exercise and sport, which was a very important part of their physical fitness regime. So, seeing the activity that happened in the few years prior to 2360 may not have stood out in particular, except some parts of it were more organized than they had been. What was happening was the colonists of the belt, who called themselves spacers, were busy building interstellar ships. They were ugly machines, very practical. Each one was built out of 2 asteroids. One was an asteroid made principally of ice, and the other one was a rocky asteroid, and rocky and metallic. The way the ships worked was, the functioning of the ships was simple and elegant, yet still spoke to a spirit of great curiosity and knowledge. In each ice asteroid was embedded what was called an Abara drive, named after a scientist, William Abara. It's rather poetic that the name of the scientist who opened the stars to the human race, his surname was Abara, which is in the Yoruba language of Nigeria means spirit. William Abara had a great spirit which longed to spread to the stars. He was worried about the survival of the human race in the climate catastrophe created by the situations of the 20th century. So it was in the spirit that he created the drive that was later named after him, to help the human race spread, to flow like a river into the stars. He would have been horrified at having it named after him. He wasn't a scientist who needed his name up in lights and things named. He called it a gravity fusion drive. It used small captive black holes to process the water and ice inside the asteroid to create a constant thrust. This asteroid was attached to a rocky asteroid, which was the principal living area, hollowed out with up to 100,000 people in suspended animation, or what they like to call cold sleep, and about 200 active waking crew on a rotation. So anyone watching would have seen this activity taking place, these 50 ships getting built slowly over the course of a few years. Would have watched them get filled up with pods and equipment and fired off into space. All 50 engines were fired in quick succession, as the optimal path had been chosen to get all 50 ships out of the solar system with a minimum chance of encountering astronomical bodies that would cause problems, especially at the speeds the ships would be moving fairly soon. And So, in quick succession, in the space of 3 minutes, 50 ships, each one with over 100,000 people, started their journey to leave the solar system, heading towards our nearest neighbor, Proxima Centauri. They went off not knowing if there was anything hospitable waiting for them. Planets had been discovered that seemed a possibility of supporting life. But these people had lived in the asteroid belt for nearly 200 years. They weren't obsessed with planets and skies. Most of them, the vast majority, had never even walked on a planet's surface. At least not one where the horizon wasn't just a few meters away. They were familiar with the depths of space above their heads, and no gravity to hold them down, or at least very little. Most of them grew up in hollowed out asteroids in the belt, with wearing magnetic boots to keep them on the ground, and doing exercises regularly to simulate gravity, but most of them had really not been in gravity for much of their lives. So it was actually a strange experience for them, these constant acceleration ships. They were designed to accelerate at 1G exactly, until the time came to them to start slowing down again at 1G exactly. From the perspective of the people of the Earth, it would look like these ships were taking about 5.5 years. It would take them about a year to get close to the speed of light, and about a year to slow down again. And Proxima Centauri is about 4.5 light years away, 4.6 light years away. To the people on the ship, thanks to relativity, it would appear about a year shorter. Although nobody on the ship would stay awake through the entire trip. There was initial 200-person crew for the departure, and that same crew would all be awake for the end of the arrival. The flight crews would be put down to sleep after a week, and there would be a rotating maintenance crew to take care of things. Most of them would be on a 6-week rotation for the 3.5-year trip, or at least what would seem like a 3.5-year trip to them, because travel at relativistic speeds is absolutely mind-boggling and doesn't make any kind of sense. The ship we are focusing on today was called Zambezi. All 50 ships were named after the rivers of the Earth because they were representing the flow of humanity to the stars. The Afropolitan Space Union was the organization that was based on the continent of Africa and also in the belt itself that was bringing the humans to the stars. The Afropolitan Space Union had been founded towards the end of the 21st century, based around the concept of a space elevator built in the mountains on the equator in the center of the continent. The people who came up with the idea thought that it would be more fuel efficient to boost capsules up to partial orbit and then let the spin of the Earth carry on just with the movement and momentum and fling them off the end. These capsules then were guided. They weren't just like dumb rocks, and were flown under that momentum with a little bit of extra kick and power and some thrusters to control the direction into the asteroid belt. Those first few hundred and then later 1,000 people became the root of the Afropolitan Space Union and were the first people to spread outside of the Earth to live forever. While America got involved in internal issues East Asia, the Chinese and Japanese, along with some Australian and New Zealand people, in the face of climate change, decided to colonize Mars. The Mars colony was a difficult place to live, it was very harsh, and resources were scarce. But the Afropolitans provided a lot of support and resources from the belt where things were not scarce. Once the processes for mining the belt were finalized, it became actually quite easy to produce water and hydrocarbons for food, and metals and everything were quite plentiful. The processes, once they were established, just needed to be fed, and the African people, the Afropolitan people, the spacers, as I've mentioned, would just work their regular shifts for a few hours a week and produce for the belt and for Mars. They also provided a lot of resources back to the Afropolitan Union, still remaining on Earth, and things were generally fairly comfortable there. Everyone had a universal basic income. People still worked because work needed to be done, but nobody was worried about dying or starving to death or not being able to pay medical expenses. So overall, life was pretty good. William Abara, the inventor of the gravity fusion drive, or Abara drive as it became known after he died, because he would never have allowed anyone to call it that while he was alive, had been the head scientist and at one stage director of the Afropolitan Space Union. They believed in moving people far, fast, and as quickly and safely and cheaply as possible. Zambezi was the 15th ship to fire, only about a minute after the first. The flight crew were going over the checks, watching for any issues, but everything was nominal. The pilot was Raiden Cameron. She called out the checks, and her co-pilot Patrick Alex and Corey Darron responded with the appropriate responses. All systems nominal, said Corey Darron, the flight engineer. They had been watching the instruments very carefully, and very little exciting or dangerous had happened. Patrick Alex was watching the flight path as the co-pilot, while Raiden Cameron was firing the controls. Cameron was an extremely good pilot and needed very little correction. All was normal, flight checks were nominal, and there were no problems. So, said Patrick Alex, we are heading to a new star. Corey Darron took a deep breath. Quite a strange thing to be leaving our whole world behind us, isn't it? Leaving behind all we've known, everybody we know. Raiden Cameron, she had been a fighter pilot and a transport pilot. She was driven by adventure more than the others. To her, this was exciting. To them, it was a duty. To the human race. So she said to them, she smiled and said excitedly, yes, but we are going where no one has gone before. With 10 minutes of the flight starting, the green light came, and the flight crew unbelted themselves. Now, as I said earlier, most of the people of the belt, the spacers, had never really experienced gravity for any sustained period. They trained and they used equipment to exercise their muscles to prevent atrophy, but as they put their feet down, this was the first time they felt a sustained 1G gravity in their entire lives. Patrick stretched, looked uncomfortable. I can't believe the people of Earth live like this all the time. I feel like I'm filled with cement. Raiden Cameron, who as part of her pilot training had spent time on Earth to experience the gravity well there, told him that he would get used to it. But In a week's time, they would be asleep, and then they'd be awake for another week, and then they'd probably be into microgravity or zero-G gravity again. The watch team that was waiting took over from the main flight crew. We don't know their full names, but they were known as Ensign Paxt and Ensign ASOC. The flight crew left the flight deck and went through to the mess. They had not eaten for a while. It was considered a better idea probably not to have full stomachs on departure, because they weren't sure what the gravity would do to people's digestions. They didn't want anybody being sick while they were trying to concentrate on the sensitive process. They sat around eating their rations. The rations on the African ships were principally simple food, hearty but tasty, highly spiced. Very unlike what we would consider regular military or NASA rations here in the 21st century. One advance from the 21st century that had carried through up to even now into the 24th century, that had enabled the spread into the stars and made things more pleasant, and they still managed to keep developing despite the fundamental good idea, was the artificial meat that was the center of most of the diet. Protein was easy and plentiful in the belt because hydrocarbons were everywhere, particularly in the RC asteroids, which were also these water supplies and fuel supplies for many of the asteroid belt ships. So the hydrocarbons were used to produce artificial meat, mostly beef and hamburgers and ground beef. So what they ate looked a lot like what we eat today if you just simply make yourself a hamburger or any kind of pasta with mince or anything like that. Their food was mostly Central and North African in style, so full of spices and flavor and garlic. They discussed what would happen. "I'm not sure about this cold sleep thing," said Raiden Cameron. "I think I would actually prefer to be awake through the entire trip." "What does it feel like?" "It must feel almost like dying to lie down and close your eyes and have no dreams for 3 years or more." Patrick and Corey both, not being quite as adventurous as Raiden, were quite happy with sleeping through what could be a very long and boring trip. Patrick even said to Raiden, "You would be very bored within a couple of weeks. Nothing much is going to happen on this trip. You'd be sitting playing cards with the maintenance crews and doing nothing else. And you'd be way older by the time we wake up, and you'd be jealous." Raiden laughed, threw a napkin at him. "You're older than me, I'd give you a chance to catch up," she said. Anyway, they finished their meal, and they went for a medical checkup. Nobody really expected anything to have gone wrong in the last couple of hours since departure, but just to be sure that it was protocol. Raiden, Patrick, and Corey all underwent a physical check, checking their response times, checking skin conductivity and all sorts of things, just to see if there were any potential issues, and they were found to be perfectly healthy, unsurprisingly. Then they all went to gym to start getting some exercise. The week after departure wasn't exactly an exciting time. Well, not all the time. But in the depths of space, you don't want excitement, because excitement means that you might die. Life on the belt was not exactly harsh, but danger and death were just a few inches away most of the time. A rogue asteroid could easily punch a hole in a ship hull or in the side of a colony. Entire colonies had been lost to diseases and infections when things got rampant and weren't caught in time. asteroid colonies had hit into each other, and some had vented into the atmosphere and lost thousands. Life wasn't hard because the resources were plentiful, but danger was never very far away. So an uneventful trip through space is exactly the kind of trip through space that you want. The crew went for regular checkups, observations, they trained, they exercised. They weren't expecting to find any life out there or anything that could be a risk, but they did weapons training, target practice, they did martial arts training. The martial arts of the flight crews of the Afropolitan Space Union, particularly the military ones, were quite interesting. They used a blend of martial arts from all around the world, but it was mostly focused on just subduing an enemy as quickly as possible. There was one incident that happened when they just passed Jupiter after about 3 days. This is something you've got to realize. Constant acceleration drives start to go fast. 1g acceleration doesn't sound like much, but when it happens constantly, it gets quick very quickly. So they were doing a pretty substantial speed when they hit the rogue asteroid. The ship, the entire frame of Zambesi, well, as far as a frame goes, with it being made of solid rock and iron, shook. Lights went red and alarms went. The ship didn't slow down at all because it was already going very fast, but there had definitely sign of an impact. The work and maintenance crews that were in the front of the ship in the main rocky asteroid got there fast and sealed up the cracks. Nobody was hurt or injured. There were a few people that were short of breath and needed some oxygen after a bit of a traumatic experience, but overall it wasn't too serious. For safety's sake, it was decided that some crews would go out and do an exterior check on the outside of the asteroid. Now, while normally one wouldn't risk an entire flight crew that is needed for deceleration in 3.5 years' time, of the people that were still awake, the most qualified and experienced for extravehicular activities were the current flight crew. So the three of them suited up, along with 3 technicians, and they went for a nice walk out in the sun. The airlocks were quite small, the ones towards the front of the ship, so they had to go out in 2 groups of 3. The flight crew went out first, and then the technicians came out after them. Once they were all out, they used very special equipment to anchor into the outside of the asteroid that bit into the rock to prevent them from floating off, because that would be extremely bad. There was no stopping the ship. Anybody who fell off would be wandering the solar system at very high speeds alone for a very long time. So they moved on carefully, very much like climbers, anchoring their ropes into the rock and moving on slowly and carefully to look where the asteroid, to the point where they believed the asteroid had hit. When they got there, the site of the impact was still quite warm. They couldn't feel it through their spacesuits, but they had temperature probes that showed this, and they saw that it was probably an asteroid about the size of a basketball. The speeds they were doing, they just annihilated it and basically turned into heat and made a few cracks in the outside. The flight crew just anchored themselves around and kept an eye on the technicians, who were not quite as experienced at walking outside in space, while they mixed up a special plastic sort of cement and filled up the gaps from the outside. The repair job was probably stronger than the original rock that was there in the first place, so there would never be a problem with this one again. While they spent some time outside, the flight crew cast their eyes towards the sun, which was getting very small in the distance already. It was basically just a large bright star by now. Raid and Cameron turned and looked towards where they were going, because she only had eyes for the future, while Patrick Ilex and Corey Darren, he and they, cast eyes on their past. The two of them had never even been to Earth, and they were leaving it behind. The home of their species was disappearing in their rearview mirrors, and while they were excited about the future that was ahead of them, they were a little bit sad about what they were leaving behind. Eventually, after about an hour, oxygen levels were getting a little bit low, but nothing critical. They followed their safety line back to the airlock and went back inside. And that was basically the last of the excitement. It was 2 days into the trip, or a couple of days into their trip. They had a few days left to go. They were back into their cycle of exercising and medical checkups and eating and gymming and sleeping. 7 days into the trip, it was time. They were called into the sleep chamber, where the 3 pods waited for them. This time they underwent very detailed medical checks, because once they were put down, it was very difficult to render any aid into their frozen cells and bodies. Any problems now would still be there when they woke up. But of course, you don't get selected to be on a flight crew in an interstellar spaceship if you have any physical problems. So they were all fit and firm and healthy and hale, and nothing was wrong with them whatsoever. So they got out of their jumpsuits that they wore around the ship. They got into tight-fitting, what also looked a bit like a jumpsuit or like a sci-fi sort of armor that had various plugs and ports in it to monitor their life functions and provide them with electrical and neural stimulation while they were sleeping. It had been found that if people weren't stimulated somewhat while they were in cold sleep, they tended to have psychological issues when they woke up. While you can be asleep for a very long time quite happily, if you get caught in bad dreams or anxiety, that ends quite badly for you, especially if you're stuck like that for 3 years. And so they put on their sensor suits and their helmets. They climbed into their pods. Technicians connected the sensor suits and helmets up to ports on the insides of the pods, connected the pods, and they closed the lids. The crew could still speak to each other while they were awake. There was small radios and speakers in the pods, so they were chatting about their various plans, what they thought Proxima Centauri would be like when they wake up. And they weren't too sure. They read the reports, but they had the feeling that at the distance of 4.6 light years, maybe the reports weren't entirely accurate. Eventually, the timer started. They were injected with drugs that slowed their natural processes and were started to cool. Then the timers ran. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. But by the time the countdown got to 1, they were all well asleep. And they would remain asleep for another 3.5 years. Thanks for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales podcast, the Sleeper 8 podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week, and I'm also aiming, although it's not very easy right now, to be putting out a few extra episodes to help build up the archive, so that you, the listener, can have a night's worth of stories to leave running in the background as soon as possible. So keep an eye out once you've subscribed to see what comes up the feed. A reminder that the music for tonight is Un Désert Bakumiku from the Free Music Archive. Check out more of their work on their website and their Patreon, which you will find linked in the show notes, because they've got some very interesting stuff and they're well worthy of support. So good night and sweet dreams.